tape number 28, Track B, Security Issues with Configuring and Maintaining an IIS-4 Server.
Started then, and if people want to wander in, they can wander in. First of all, if you think this is a talk on electronic commerce, you're in the wrong talk. They've announced the changes several times, but they never wrote them down anywhere, I don't think. So it may be a little bit confusing for you, and if you got to go, you got to go, because you may be expecting this to be an electronic commerce session. I believe it's at something like 2:40 this afternoon in this same room. Okay, so electronic commerce people, you know, hey, you got to do what you got to do. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Eugene Schultz, and I work for Global Integrity Corporation and also Purdue University, where I actually am a faculty member there. It's an unusual arrangement that's been worked out, and it's working out well, except that they forced me to move to the cornfields of Indiana. And it's kind of a shock for me because I come from San Francisco, California, but I'm getting used to it. You know, it's just a different kind of place. Any of you from Indiana? Okay, whereabouts? South Bend, and you've lived in Lafayette, and you're a survivor of the Lafayette experience, right? There's not much to do there, and they have weird cultural traditions, like getting together and drinking beer and eating Jell-O. You know, stuff like that that's just a little hard to relate to. Yeah, see, you laughed. I know you can understand what that means. And Global Integrity is a spinoff of SAIC, and it's been a super company for me, and they do security-related consulting of all varieties. With that in mind, let's get started, and I want to go, before I go any further, I want to tell you that I am not either anti-Microsoft or pro-Microsoft. I am officially right in the middle. Let's face it, people, I come from a Unix background too, and I got to tell you that their products and Windows NT are going to be here for a while. We might as well learn to make peace with them and learn to live with the dang things. And so the purpose of my talk today is not to run down a Microsoft product at all. My purpose is, look, probably most of you have to deal with this product. What are you going to do with it in terms of having to deal with the security of this particular product? Now, IIS is an acronym, and it does kind of remind me of a story. There was a guy who comes into the airport in Baltimore, and he comes rushing out of the airport, and he goes to a restaurant. He's waited on immediately by a waitress. The guy's really in a hurry, and he says, look, he says, I work for the FBI, I have a PhD from UCLA, I just flew in on TWA to BWI, and I would like a BLT ASAP. And the waitress says, oh, she says, do you want it toasted? And he says, no, I don't have time. So she comes back 5 minutes later, puts the sandwich down, and before she can get too far away, he says, this sandwich is PNG. And she says, PNG, huh? She says, well, SHIT. And he goes, SHIT? She says, should have had it toasted. So anyway, acronyms are a complex world of communicating with people, and IIS is no exception. We have 4 parts to this now shortened talk. An introduction, an actual examination into the vulnerabilities. Of course, there are solutions for most of these vulnerabilities. The question is, how much effort, time, resources do you have to do them? And then a conclusion. I should mention also that although IIS has a lot of bugs, don't think that Apache doesn't. You've been watching the buffer overflow problems that have been posted out the net with Apache. And by the way, Netscape, despite being also a very good product, has its share of bugs. And then both Netscape Enterprise Server and Netscape Commerce Server. Well, man, I love watching all these news postings. I actually put the website here. By the way, they even put the wrong handouts for me. My handouts indicate that I'm doing something like extreme hacking, and the way you can get these handouts are either just leave me your email address or just hit I understand tomorrow they're going to post at www.blackhat.org. They're going to post all the talks, and this is one. I'm really sorry about that, and I don't know what happened, but anyway, we got it worked out, we think. According to federal officials, federal websites and computer systems are particularly vulnerable to outside attacks because they lack 2 important elements: adherence to security plans and qualified personnel to maintain security measures. I wonder if that's true. Let's take a little more look in IIS. IIS, number 1, you're going to have to live with it. You know why you have to live with it? Because it is used so widely, because its price is right. How much does IIS cost? It's free. Comes with NT 4.0 server. So when you buy it, you can install, of course, if you want to, you can install IIS either web server or FTP server. We're going to talk about the web server today. And in addition to that, many of you probably work at a place where you're beating your competition. You've got to go out with this new web application before your competition does to announce some achievement or announce some new product. And IIS actually is one of the easier to implement web servers, and we'll find out what security implications that has in just a second. You can implement using either CGI or IIS API or active service pages and active server pages, excuse me. And front page is certainly a very related component to the whole IIS arena because it supports the actual development of your web pages as well as ability to maintain them. Actually, front page is not a very simple facility. It consists of an explorer on the client side as well as an editor on the client side, then the server itself, the front page server itself, then all these front page extensions. And that's what the webmaster uses for things like managing your hypertext pages as well as referencing them. You also have front page bots that do things like, for instance, on a document, it'll automatically create a table of contents. Okay, first dilemma. How do we secure a web server? Well, I suppose one way we could secure a web server is to simply put into the web application itself, into the server itself, some means of identifying the user. But Microsoft said, look, we know there's a lot of web attacks. We know that a lot of people get hacked. So because of that, we're going to try to see if we can't use a stronger form of authentication. The actual order in which IIS checks an incoming HTTP request is, first of all, it wants to see if the user is an anonymous user. And if so, it does a very simple kind of anonymous authentication. If not, it looks to see if that user is capable of participating in Microsoft's challenge response authentication. For those of you who aren't too familiar with this arena, I have a slide on it in the next slide, but that's only if the anonymous access fails. If you have challenge response authentication, you actually send a challenge string across the net over from the server to the client, and the client has to encrypt this particular challenge string in a way I'll show you in the next slide. If neither the anonymous authentication work or the challenge response authentication works, well, you go to clear text. You just pass a clear text password. And by the way, this happens for every access. People don't often realize with IIS just how often authentication actually does. But for each access, you separately authenticate that access. As far as the actual challenge response authentication, any of you who have taken an NT security course from me probably see this and identify it as a slide from hell. But this slide shows how when the client requests authentication, the program called MSV1_0 takes the request from the client and passes back over the net an 8-byte nonce, which for those of you who are into cryptology know that means a random challenge string. Except those of you who know about random challenge strings know that actually they're very seldom truly random. And indeed, some company named Password Authority figured that out and figured out how to actually do a differential analysis to separate the challenge string by other parts that are passed over the net. The client then receives this 8-byte challenge string, and it encrypts the challenge string with 7 bytes of the password plus 1 parity byte. Then it goes and takes the 8 bytes again, and in a completely new encryption, it's not re-encrypting everything, it takes the next 7 bytes of the password and 1 parity byte, and then it takes 2 bytes, the remaining 2 bytes of the password, and adds 5 bytes of nulls plus 1 byte of parity for a total of 8 to encrypt the 8 bytes again. So it actually ends up passing back 24 bytes of encrypted nonce back to the server, the web server that's authenticating it. Well, the server then retrieves whatever entries it has from the SAM database, the authentication database, encrypts the nonce in exactly the same way the client does, and if the encrypted string is exactly the same, byte for byte, bit for bit, then you have a successful authentication to the IIS web server. And the way you set this authentication, you don't have to use the default settings. You could, for instance, demand that only Windows NT challenge response is used. That's stronger. It's not perfect. There are bugs in the process. If you've read, for instance, Mudge's and Bruce Schneier's paper on some bugs in the process of challenge response in NT, you'll know that a clever saboteur could do things like start to guess things like what the nonce is, what the identity of the password might be over the net. But you can choose any or all of the authentication alternatives simply by using your Internet Service Manager, installs in your desktop when you install IIS. Okay? So the basic access control methods then for IIS web services include authentication, and we've just gone over that. They also include the fact that by default, IIS tries to limit the execution environment. We're going to find that this one breaks down. Also, you have the NT file system permissions, and people sometimes get unhappy with NT, and we know that they found a lot more vulnerabilities in NT than we ever thought. I really didn't think it was possible to find all these vulnerabilities when NT first came out in August 1993. But I stopped making a list of all the vulnerabilities at about 170. And now I firmly believe there's about 300 actual documented vulnerabilities in NT itself. Now, is it the worst operating system in the world for vulnerability? No way. Honestly speaking, for those of you like other operating systems, chances are, like for instance, look at all the bugs they've been finding in Linux, right? And kernel panics and things like that. There have been quite, a newer operating system is going to have more security-related flaws. They'll work the bugs out of the newer operating systems over time. But NTFS is a good, strong file system for the sake of security. It's got problems. It's a streams-based file system, right? You're always writing to something other than the final destination. The file system's always doing that. And anybody who knows how to make hooks to the streams can end up stealing file contents before they're actually written to their final path. But the NTFS permissions are another piece of controlling the access in IIS web server. And then lastly, there's the Internet Service Manager settings themselves. And a number of these settings do affect security. They're mostly in the tab called Advanced at the top of the default screen. Well, there's some exposures in the IIS web services themselves. One of the worst is, what if you don't like Internet Explorer? How many of you like Internet Explorer? I'm just curious. How many just hate it, don't want to use it ever again in your life? Okay, I'm kind of one of those latter people, sorry. But I really much prefer one of the Netscape browsers. And if you use Netscape to authenticate to an NT web server, guess what? IIS web server. Challenge response. So your client doesn't understand anything about nonces, doesn't understand anything about the encryption and how the parity is set in for the encryption, and so it's not able to participate. Your client won't be able to participate in authentication, and that drives clear text as probably the most commonly used form of authentication when you're not using an Internet Explorer browser. Believe it or not, Microsoft and the Department of Justice have some kind of problem right now. I don't know exactly what it is, but I guess the Department of Justice says that there's too many Internet Explorer browsers out there and too many, and all on down the line. And of course, Netscape's sitting there and taking it all in. Number two, this is a real serious problem. When you get question.
Yeah, how is the lack of support for full authentication in Netscape a deficiency in IIS?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the second part of your question, but I did hear the first part.
How is the lack of a feature set in Netscape a deficiency in IIS?
Well, here's the problem, okay? If you don't do exactly what I expect you to do, I have to go to my lower common denominator. The question was, why is the lack of a feature in Netscape a problem for IIS? And the reason is that it forces IIS to go to lowest common denominator. Okay, in other words, you don't do things exactly my way, well, what we're going to have to do is play on a lower plane. That is a security problem.
Okay, well, what authentication schemes does Netscape support that IIS does not?
What authentication schemes does Netscape support? You know what? That's a great question, but can we defer it to the end or we won't get through? Super question, okay? And by the way, again, I would not say that IIS is the only web server that has security problems. Netscape has its own set of problems, if you've been following the net, and Apache and the other major ones. So again, don't think I'm picking on IIS at all. I'm just saying a lot of people use it. You better know how to defend it. So the model for authentication with IIS web servers is that users either are authenticated as local users. They get put in a volatile group in Windows NT called interactive. If you're in the interactive group, that means you are considered a local user on that machine. And if the web server is installed on a domain controller, you actually receive domain authentication. So for instance, if you have within your domain 50 servers, one of which is a web server, but that web server is installed on a domain controller, that domain controller will at that point authenticate you, create an access token for you, and pass that access token to the other domain controllers to make you potentially eligible, depending on what your group memberships are and so on, for access to other servers within the domain, and possibly workstations too. The problem with local access is that if you are a local user, some of the security controls that are placed on remote connections do not apply to local users. For instance, if you are a local user, engaging in share access to the machine on which you're a local user doesn't really make much sense. You have direct access potentially to the file system depending on how the NT file system permissions are set. And of course, if you have unauthorized access to a web server that's installed on a domain controller, it puts the possibility of getting rogue access to the servers within the domain. Another problem that's actually fairly severe is that IIS runs as system. System is a non-interactive, non-shell ID in Windows NT that's allowed virtually to do almost anything it wants to do on a local machine, but then system on one machine doesn't recognize system on another. So it's not like in Unix, where if you're root on one machine, you have an advantage in reaching other machines on the net. System contains its own privilege on a per machine basis at least. But the problem with this is that if there is some exploitable vulnerability, and you are able to, let's say, create a buffer overflow condition, and this, are we okay on terms, where I simply flood input past what the reserved memory for this input is, and something happens. Something happens. Often what happens is that other instructions in memory get overwritten, and so they will execute whenever this part of memory is read. And the point is that if you run a web server as system on Windows NT and you are able to abuse a vulnerability, that gives you the potential for, if you work an exploit, to run with elevated privileges, very high privileges on an NT box. I think it's fair to use this statement. I really thought it through, but there have been quite a few buffer overflow conditions discovered in IIS. And I'm going to talk about some specific ones in just a minute. Again, when you look at Apache, you certainly have to say the same kind of statement applies. Another problem is that there is an account that created called IUSR and then the underscore name of the server. So if your server is called web server, then this account would be called IUSR underscore web server. And it's created, again, either in that would actually give access, illegal access to this account, would give illegal access to that machine itself. In other words, it might be possible, if you are running the telnet service on that machine, to telnet to that box from a client and password guess to reach this particular machine, or find shares that are allowed for this particular account if somebody has been so stupid as to set up these kinds of shares. One of the problems with active server page ASP is that one of the really severe problems is that although ASP is supposed to constrain environment, it doesn't really do it quite well enough, and you have to kind of help it. You have to make some hacks if you want. It's able to reach some things. If you are running ASP, then you are able to reach some things that you really shouldn't be able to get to. And again, I have some examples here. The environment by default is not really constrained well enough in terms of what part of the file system you're able to reach, what you're able to run. Question?
Is
Is it a problem with decom or something else, or is it permission problems? I'd say in most of the cases I've looked at, certainly permission problems have been up there. Okay? The front page really has quite a few vulnerabilities too, including the flaws in it that allow you unauthorized privileged access to the web server, or ability to go clobber files. Read a file, overwrite a particular file, and denial of service, where, for instance, you might send input that is not recognized as you use a server extension that causes the web server itself or possibly the machine to crash. There are some other, and these are just the general ones. I'm going over some real specific ones in just a second, but certainly active server itself has had its share of problems with denial of service, again, ability to clobber the web page content, and ability to read and or alter files within the file system itself, not just what are part of the web server. And there are bots that are used in connection with front page that can be used to create things like a table of contents. And these bots can also be used to allow unauthorized reads or modification of your web pages. But understand this, I mean, it's possible to dwell on all the problems that have surfaced with active server and front page and IIS itself, which includes those arenas. But understand that if you buy the most secure web server in the universe and you write a terrible web application, that you're doomed. It doesn't do any magic to go out. It's no golden grail to go out and buy some product as far as your web server product itself goes, and then do a completely flawed IIS API or CGI implementation. And most web implementations themselves are not well written. Okay? So understand that it's possible to shoot at the wrong target here. You may get nervous about bugs in one particular web server, whether it be IIS or whether it be the Netscape Commerce Server or whatever you're talking about, but if you write your web server application poorly, you're doomed. You've had it. And some of the common mistakes that people make are things like, for instance, if they have to run a routine with elevated privilege, and then you exit that routine and they don't withdraw privileges as you come out of the routine. So for the running of the next routine, there's elevated privileges there. Somebody now is able to maybe escape from that routine at point. They may be able to escape with elevated privileges. Some people use server-side includes. Okay, nice idea, but server-side includes allow me to exec something from a line in a form. So now I've got this line that it allows me to put in my last name, but instead I exec a program. What if it's a bogus program, a Trojan horse program? People make incredible mistakes when writing web servers, so never lose perspective of that, please. Yeah?
One question will be kind of a quick one, because I don't want to kick you off topic.
Oh, you can. We can't go too far off topic, but go ahead. Let's see how far off topic it takes us.
Talking about flawed implementations, a lot of them aren't written very well. One really popular one, obviously, is Outlook Web Access.
Okay, Outlook Web Access being an example of a flawed application.
Is it?
I don't know. Now we're talking about using an Outlook client,
No,
right?
Basically, it's a web application. You hit it with any browser, you get a screen, asks you to log in, but you get a Chap Authentication.
Okay, it gives you Chap Authentication. Actually, there's different varieties of Chap Authentication in the Windows NT arena at large. Is that a particularly holy application? I don't know. Okay, I can find out real quick for you, but I don't know. Anybody know?
Yeah.
Yeah, that one's full of holes. What are some of the worst problems? Probably buffer overflow. It relies on the directories in NT server itself, and instead of the virtual directories that it should create, right, to reference. Okay? Let me go through like David Letterman and give you a 10 list, except I've started kind of with number 1 here for reasons that I don't fully understand. I went through and I read through the postings on sources like NT Bug Tracks and Root Shell and Rootkit and other major sites to try to get a picture for you all of what's kind of happening in terms of the vulnerability arena in the IIS arena. One of them is a buffer overflow condition. It's connected to the IIS API extension called ism.dll. And this is a filter that allows you to reach and change the .htr files. And the reason you need .htr files is that these files enable you to set passwords for the web server. And somebody could crash IIS just by simply sending a long argument. I've put the format here. Or they could, if they were pretty smart, execute road code if they knew exactly where the overflow point was for the buffer. This affects IIS version 4.0 with service packs 4 and 5. It is a lack of proper bounds checking, and you can, if you want to go through just a little work, it's not too bad, go to your internet service manager and make a change that basically removes the mapping to the .htr files whenever isapi.dll is run. And this is a whole series of steps. You know, one of the things that I like about NT is that it's kind of easy, and it's, yeah, go ahead.
Just apply the patch. Yeah.
Okay, you just apply the patch, sorry. Okay. Number 2, there's a bug that allows people to simply utilize a default.asp page to look at and also to change source code by requesting a file from a virtual directory. The problem is when you request that file through the virtual directory, it points back to, it allows you to get to the real file. Normal processing of the file somehow doesn't work right, and as a result you can get around the normal constraints. There are actually several versions of this bug that's been published out on the major news groups out on the net. It applies to both IIS 3.0 and 4.0, and there's a patch available, but you may want to also consider removing the default.asp pages. You will almost certainly suffer some loss of functionality if you do that. Probably the patch is the best solution. There's also a bug that allows you to bypass authentication requirements for CGI scripts. This only applies to IIS 3.0. It does not apply to 4.0, and it's really more, it's not really a vulnerability like we've talked about before. It just means that an intended security feature doesn't work. Probably the easiest thing to do here is upgrade to 4.0. Another problem is somebody can discover the path to a virtual directory by being able to reach MS download that directory at the particular website. Then all you have to do is press refresh or reload. And what you can do is find out then what files are out there to gain access to. So it's more of a case of being able to browse your way to target files that you may want to do something to. And all versions of IIS are affected by this one. And at the time I did this research, which was last week, there wasn't a patch available for this particular bug. Again, it's ability to see what's out there, and by doing that, somebody could locate files that they wanted to modify. And so that's about a medium, I would say, about a medium seriousness bug. Another problem is that you can send a misshaped GET request over to the IIS server, and it can cause data corruption. But in order to do this, you have to be running multiple web servers on the same actual physical platform. And the problem is that if you quit out of inetinfo.exe on one particular server, that trashes the ability of the other server to be able to get to some temp files that it needs for data rights. And the problem is pretty robust over different option packs and over different versions of NT. And Microsoft has developed a hotfix for this. I put the TechNet a number for you to be able to reach this if you wanted to find out more specifics about this patch. Another bug is that an unprivileged user can build an IIS API extension to be able to load and later execute the bogus CGIs that run with system level privileges. And I've got examples of these particular extensions that are the problem. Any web server that supports IIS API extensions is vulnerable to this particular one. One of the more serious aspects of this particular vulnerability is that the exploit code is really out there pretty widely, and I tried it out last week, and it is deadly. All versions are affected, and one thing you could do is use your ISM to prevent users from loading CGIs. It's perhaps a good solution. I haven't seen an actual patch for this particular problem. There is one?
No, it's because that's a coding practice.
Yeah, it's a coding practice, and whether or not a patch is actually the right way to solve that one is certainly questionable. Another is this is pretty interesting. Again, there is a layer of networking in Windows NT called NetBIOS. NetBIOS is a session layer protocol, and it's possible for an anonymous user to use NetBIOS mechanisms to be able to abuse the web server. You can reach, for instance, a path, system root, system32, inet serv, ISA, ADM, PWD. And for looking at that last part of the path, this has something to do with the change of passwords. In fact, it points to the virtual directory, which is IIS, ADM, PWD, allowing you to start up .htr files. What this enables you to do if you abuse this particular problem is change passwords without authorization, and it also does make information about accounts available. The best solution, I believe, is still being debated out on the net. One would be to delete the virtual directory we just referred to. Another fairly strong solution is to block inbound traffic from unknown hosts that's bound for TCP port 139, which is your TCP session port, and actually it is also a UDP port. And this is something that is a good practice in NT anyway. For those of you who know about the tool Netcat and so on, it's a deadly tool, it does port listening and things like this. You can help prevent Netcat type attacks and other kinds of attacks if you shield your machine from just any traffic into TCP port 139. The only problem is that in the case of port blocking, the built-in port filter with NT40 is a little bit too crude. It's a little bit too all or none. You might want to go out in the net and just pull in a freeware version of this, which allows you to specify which IPs bind to this port, which IPs don't touch this port. One of them is called Nuke Nabber, if you've heard of that, Nuke Nabber. Some guy who got tired of the WinNuke attacks built this tool. It's available from www.clic.net. www.clic.net. And another reasonable port wrapper tool is one called Future IT. And their website is www.futurit, that's one word, futurit.com. Number 8, unauthorized users can reach cache files without even being authenticated. But this again requires that you have more than one web server running on a particular physical platform. The problem is both servers are going to have, if they have the same identical physical and virtual directory for the file they want to reach, there's confusion. And once somebody reaches a particular file, then the credentials aren't rechecked for the next reach. And one of the solutions here is to disable caching. Another solution might be that you might want to not install multiple web servers on the same physical platform. Another problem is failing to log successful HTTP reaches. And with a normal HTTP request, you send a file name, the default ASP, as well as the request method. And the trick here is that instead of putting in a legitimate request method, you simply put in a long string of letters, like say, I know this particular length works, 10,140 bytes worth of letters. And it's just garbage. But what happens is that at this particular point, it causes a buffer overflow, and that buffer overflow results in the fact that the IIS log then just simply ignores this particular request. And It can be found, it's not a very robust vulnerability. It's only found so far in IIS servers, 4.0 servers that have been upgraded from 3. So if you've just installed a 4.0 server and it's an original install, you shouldn't find this bug on your particular machine. Probably the best solution, therefore, is, given that there's no patch or other solutions for this particular one as of late last week when I got the final touches on this talk, it would be simply to maybe just not upgrade from 3.0 to 4.0, but do an original 4.0 install. Here's another interesting one. This doesn't crash your web server, but it does tie it up with nearly 100% CPU utilization. It's just simply calling certain ASPs in the path /xer onto root search, and then you have the final name of the path there. This doesn't work if the XR page is already in memory. If the page is already in memory, this particular bug it can't be exploited. And you may want to delete XR and everything below it in order to prevent this bug from happening. It shouldn't impair your web functionality. So, you want to take on IIS and you want to make it more secure. In addition to the solutions that were just suggested here for the specific vulnerabilities, there are some good things to consider. Number one, I do have an issue with IIS running this system. And I have installed Apache and have looked in the system logs to see what level of privilege the various processes are executing with. And I'm hard pressed to find system in my system log. The same thing is true of the Netscape Enterprise server. And so if you really need high web security, you might want to consider an alternate server to IIS. If you do use IIS, and again, there are some real strong advantages of using IIS in terms of ability to get your web server up and running soon. It has some very nice characteristics here. You should run the most recent version. You should also avoid running IIS on domain controllers. I think that's sort of a duh. You don't want to put this on domain controllers because of the way IIS authentication is done. You want to assign a strong password to the IUSR account, duh. You want to also, here's another one. Because of the problems that we've referenced, some of which allow you to get to other parts of the file system that are not part of your web server, you might want to seriously just dedicate web accessible volumes to HTTP access. One of the hugest mistakes I see people make with web servers is that when they're installing the web server, they have one big happy partition, and it's the C partition. And everything's on it, you know, system root and WinNT and Win32 app and System 32. All this is on, and then their web server's also implemented. Because of some problems, and by the way, most web servers have these problems, about really constraining where you are in the file system, you do a lot better to install a D partition and run your web server off the D partition instead of having one big happy partition that houses everything. Certainly, this is even more true if you've got really valuable things like business files and other things that aren't intended to be web accessible. You don't want them on the same partition as your web server, whether you use IIS or you use Apache or any other web server. One thing that's nice about the Internet Service Manager is that it does allow you to set permissions within it to govern access, and these permissions are looked at first when the system, the security reference monitor evaluates whether or not you are allowed access to a particular file. You can set a read for a particular group or a write for a particular group. That's a good thing to do. If I were you, I'd take a look at that setting in ISM and consider using it. Also, the front page extensions, one of the real problems is that as you use and create them, they don't follow the normal inheritance rules that objects do within the NTFS file system. Therefore, it's really important after you create a particular extension to look at the permissions that are on it and ensure that they were what intended. I mean, full control to everybody is the wrong way to go. Also, as far as active server implementations, again, the whole active server arena is a little bit scary in terms of its security capabilities. If you really have to put out a super high security web server, you might want to dodge the active server arena. And if you do use active server, it should be to access a Microsoft transaction component. You don't actually throw the code in the active server itself. A number of vulnerabilities that have surfaced over the last year simply because people have been sloppy and they just embed their code within active server itself. You want to enable IP filtering perhaps in some cases, although remember, packet filtering isn't the #1 kind of network security defense, because somebody can always spoof an address or relay from another host that's been taken over on the net. I would strongly urge you, if possible, to disable the NetBIOS layer of networking because of the ability to use NetBIOS-based mechanisms to be able to reach your web server. I'd also use SSL or HTTPS or what Microsoft has named the Privacy Control Transmission Protocol, transport or transmission protocol, to make sure you have encrypted sessions between the browser and the server. I would say, all things considered, as you look at some of these vulnerabilities, they point to the fact that probably it's better to use IIS internally than it is externally. However, some people use it externally and do fine with it and manage it fine. And so if you follow some of the suggestions that we've talked about here, I think it's something you should consider. It's just that this is, again, the whole web arena is new. It's still the security of web servers. It's not really been something that is hard and true practice in organizations. And IIS, being its complexity and many features, do make it a nice target for the bad guys. And if you keep it internally, you can take some of the pressure off it. I would strongly urge you, Microsoft does constantly make solutions available in terms of in terms of patches for IIS. And if you're running IIS, I would really keep up with what you need to do. If you do run your IIS web server externally, you should keep it independent of any domain, because any external machine on a DMZ should be a complete throwaway machine. If somebody conquers it, that's fine. They got that machine, but that's all they get. Some people, when they're running web servers like IIS, on the outside simply have a staging server that goes and overwrites the content of the web pages on the web server every X number of minutes. So if somebody does hack the server and deface the pages, that they overwrite and at least they rebuild the right pages within. This also has its downward trends too, because it can cause your net to tie up with the traffic that's used between the staging server and the web server. But some people say, well, this is, you know what, I don't think I can defend any web server. Some people say, at least I'll ensure that the pages have the right content at certain intervals. So, in conclusion, we haven't even looked into the security vulnerabilities in browsers, and certainly the Internet Explorer browser has had its share, but don't discount Netscape either. And the IIS FTP server. If you go and take a look at IIS FTP, many of the same vulnerabilities that we've looked at, similar kinds of vulnerabilities, are in the FTP end. So choose your poison for implementation. Any way you do it, again, writing a secure web application itself is a tough challenge. And securing IIS, in conclusion, requires that you really focus on IIS itself, how it authenticates, how it secures access, what directory it uses, and that you then address the vulnerabilities that have come up in this area with whatever your best solution is. You also have to deal, however, with the many extensions and all the filters that are used in this environment. They're all targets too, to the web hacker. And then the web application itself, as we mentioned before. And if you make a secure web server, but you don't secure NT itself, and you make some fatal flaws there, what good did it do to secure the web server? You know, one of the most discouraging statistics I've ever seen was there's a group called the Gartner Group. They're out of Connecticut. And they made the statistic that in their surveys, 27% of all people who were affiliated with NT systems in their organization reported that they had an unpassworded administrator account. Well, you know, Right? Somebody wants to get your web server, they get NT-based access. As administrator, your web server's dead meat. So understand that doing the right things with NT too, and there's some good guides for that. Personally, one that I've been heavily involved in is the second version of the SANS NT step-by-step. You can get that at www.sans.org, and it gives you in about 20 pages, I think, some reasonable idea of what to do with securing NT itself. And then lastly, the book from hell. The book that I've been writing for about 2.5 years is just about done. It's called, now the publisher just changed its name, but it's called Windows NT Network Security, and we're going through the last part of the editorial process. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for staying.